Well, howdy, y'all. I tip my cap to you as I've just come inside from wrestling up some memories and reminiscing about 2020 with the 3.11 Harvest League. How about if you join me today while we take a look back, complain, moan, and then also feel good about what happened in the 3.11 Harvest patch of Path of Exile. I can't do it. Oh, I can't do it. I tried. Oh man, I can't do it. Overalls and everything, I tried. This week we are reminiscing about the last year in Path of Exile, and today we're going to be chatting about Harvest League, our highs and our lows, our favorite memories, and the things that we ought to complain about Harvest. If you are new to the channel, then welcome. You can, of course, like, subscribe, and ding the bell to be notified about future video discussions just like this one. If you're a veteran of the channel, then you know the way how everything works. There is a join link if you'd like to join our Discord to chat and share memes, along with other Path of Exile newbies and veterans just like me. And, of course, if at any point in time you'd like to reference any of the particular topics or sources that we chat about today, all of those are going to be linked for your convenience down below in the video description. Without any further delays, memes, or hilarity, let's jump into the reminiscing about what Harvest League was like in the year that was 2020.
Though this land is shrouded in pain and darkness, it teems with life. Behold this sacred grove.
The story of Harvest begins with its announcement. It was announced on the official Path of Exile forums as a post on June 2nd of 2020. We all got excited. Some of us may have dressed up like blue people and then been really excited about it because we knew relatively little about this league prior to it actually being announced. We knew that it would be blue themed, but we really weren't sure what it would be. I, of course, as always with every single release since Synthesis, have just been hoping for Synthesis 2. And so I was once again hoping for Synthesis 2. And we didn't get Synthesis 2 with Harvest, but instead we got something that was very, very powerful and very, very ambitious. It was, of course, released on June 19th of 2020, and that opening weekend was an absolute blast. You can see from the player totals from Steamcharts, there were 125,000 players using the Steam client to play at its peak the game Path of Exile in June of 2020. As a caveat, that's not every player that was playing Path of Exile. There's a whole lot of players who use the standalone client like me. I use the standalone client. But to give you some perspective on the numbers of Harvest during its peak, it had 125,000 peak players playing during June. For comparison, the only other league that beats that over the last 2 years in terms of peak Steam chart numbers is Delirium. That's it. That's the only thing that beats Harvest. So in terms of hype, in terms of excitement, and in terms of the number of players using and playing Path of Exile on Steam, Harvest was undoubtedly a very, very popular thing to play, at least for players to try out. And with good reason. There's a lot of different niches of players that would have been excited for Harvest release if we're being honest with ourselves. Harvest promised us a new way to craft, which in and of itself was a massive, massive draw. But in addition to that, there was going to be a rework for Warcries, two-handers, and then also Delirium was going to be added into the core of Path of Exile with some optimization, which is what players, of course, had been asking all spring of 2024. Optimization for Delirium so more players could enjoy the power spike that was, of course, Delirium. So from the hype season and the hype cycle, we had a whole bunch of stuff that players wanted to get reworked and hopefully buffed, namely melee and melee support sort of stuff. We had a major ambitious project in terms of an overhaul of how players could be crafting through garden crafting that was coming with Harvest. And then on top of all that, we had a very, very popular league that was also going to be going core. So it makes sense that there was this multiple convergence of different various stars aligning, as it were, for Harvest to be a very, very popular summer league. Now, the meta in Harvest was quite interesting to dissect and to really observe as we were watching it unfold. 1 week into Harvest, we did our 7-day overview of the meta, and you can see above my slightly balding forehead, there's a guy up there. There's some farmer who had done a little bit of research into the numbers and was following along and tracking. And you can see based on those numbers, in terms of ascendancies, Necromancer and Trickster took the top 2 spots, whether you were playing softcore Harvest or hardcore Harvest. And then from there, it varied widely, whether that was some mixture of Saboteur, Gladiator, Juggernaut, Berserker, Assassin, and any old ideal sort of amalgamation of any good, decent starter ascendancy that could then be transitioned later on in the league. If you go and take a look at the different configurations that were popular during Harvest, you'll notice a couple of things. Of course, Wand and Shield is almost always at the top spot, simply because there's so many different configurations in Path of Exile that can take advantage of a Wand and a Shield. But what's most notable about this particular stat for us to pay attention to is that two-handed axes, two-handed maces, and two-handed swords were actually in a registerable spot to be noticed by players being played as a representative population from the entire player base. That is to say that prior to Harvest, a bunch of those different weapon configurations were not even showing up as anything more than 1% on the chart, simply because they had to show up as 1% on the chart. In this regard, for the first week, at least for the first 7 days of Harvest, I've got to say the hype and at least the sales side, the marketing side of Harvest being a rework for two-handers and for melee definitely delivered. I think that players really wanted to try out and were excited to try out the various different configurations that were previewed through the archetypes that Grinding Gear Games showed off in the various trailers and various teases leading up to Harvest. Harvest, in a lot of ways, in terms of its reception, was similar to an animal farm. A successful animal farm has lots and lots of animals, and a successful animal farm will also have a lot of waste from those animals, and you don't want to be caught downwind of a successful animal farm. While there were several different groups of players inside the Path of Exile community that simply loved Harvest on its hype and loved it on its delivery and loved it throughout its league, there were several groups of players that found different things to argue about, different things problematic in terms of the balance and the opportunity cost that was available inside Harvest. The number one debate that raged throughout all of Harvest, at least in terms of my own personal rankings of debating, I don't know, maybe I need to come up with like a paint metric of that. If you want to see me do a paint metric of that, I guess leave me a comment down below. But the number one observable discussion that was going on throughout all of Harvest was players arguing about whether or not it was good for the game, the amount of player power that was added through the sort of item editing style crafting that was now available through Harvest Garden Crafting. One of the top posts during Harvest's launch and during its league was, why exactly is people crafting good gear bad for the game? And that is a massive post with hundreds of comments on it. And of course, that's linked down below if you want to go back and revisit it. While a lot of players really enjoyed the crafting side of things, other players were taking a look at things like Steamcharts and noticing that a lot of players were either getting burnt out playing Harvest or simply didn't like Harvest and were dropping off. Another post that is featured here is titled, Harvest League Broke Historical Records for Highest Percentage Drop in Steam Players After a Week. A top-rated comment from that thread reads as follows. As a longtime player, my biggest peeve is that the tedious stuff isn't going away and each expansion is adding more tedium and grind to the equation. Playing the story for the 100th time isn't fun. Unveiling every single decent mod for the 7th league in a row isn't fun. 20 tons of visual noise impeding your ability to see what is happening isn't fun, and so on and so on. Another debate that cropped up during Harvest was the following. Please stop misrepresenting the issue. We're not asking for an easier game. We're asking for a clear path of grindy and steady progression. This was, of course, included in and lumped in with all of the discussion about how difficult the game was, alongside how difficult it is to craft regular gear using regular classic crafting, and how easy it is in comparison to use Harvest crafting and the various trade-offs included with that. To quote the great Tarky, water is wet and Reddit is angry. That is certainly a statement that was true throughout the course of Harvest League. Just like Billy Mays, but wait, there's more Reddit anger. Reddit was extremely upset, excruciatingly so, over the new specialized league tabs that Grinding Gear Games came out with around the time of Harvest. Of course, at this point in time, we got the Blight, Metamorph, and Delirium tabs that were added and that were completely 100% optional. And I'm sorry I've even brought it up because I'm sure some of you are going to rip me down below in the comments. Iron, how could you ever defend Grinding Gear Games selling us stash tabs? Anyway, I'm not going to get into that. My point here is simply to say this was a controversy that happened at about the same time, and I've got to bring it up. It would not be an appropriate review of 2020, including Harvest, as a look back on the year that was without at least mentioning that there were a lot of people that were really upset about the way how those newest stash tabs were released, were advertised, and were promoted. Another incredibly popular thread was simply titled, "I've started rage quitting PoE and I want to share why." This is with 4.8k hours played. The poster says, "With many hours played, I have only recently in the last couple of leagues started rage quitting. The reason, as you might expect, is dying. I play softcore, so realistically dying isn't that big of a deal. You respawn in town, you lose a bit of XP, you have to use a portal, you have to run back to wherever you were in the map to continue. But I find myself just quitting out of anger because of the following reason. With 4.8k hours still played, I still cannot confidently identify what is killing me." This, of course, led to the very hot topic and hot discussion of, hey, why don't we have a death recap? And there were even some comments from Grinding Gear Games on this regarding why we don't have a death recap and what are some of the problems that could be associated with doing a death recap. But I just want to say the same thing as what we've said about earlier in the year regarding trade. It's the same thing about a death recap. If you've got a suggestion on how to improve displaying how players die in Path of Exile and giving essentially a digestible format or a story to be able to give players a snapshot of what killed them, the answer simply is players have come up with suggestions about how to tackle this, have submitted it to Grinding Gear Games, and have summarily been smacked alongside the head and told, go away, shut up, we're not doing it. Maybe this is something that's coming with PoE 2 and 4.0. I just think at this point we've got so many hopes. It almost feels like PoE 2 and 4.0 are just like this magical genie sort of container that everybody who wants anything in Path of Exile is just cramming everything into the genie's bottle. And the reality is at some point the genie's bottle will get filled, and there's only so much that PoE 2 4.0 can deliver for us. There's only so much room. It's going to be a finite product that comes out. And so ultimately, some portion of the player base is going to be upset that their idea, their suggestion didn't get included, and there's not new quality of life coming alongside with the release of 4.0 PoE2. But I digress. That's another conversation for another day. The point being, a lot of players were unhappy with Harvest, and part of that, I think, again, is due to burnout. Players simply doing the same thing long enough and finally realizing, you know what, I don't enjoy it, and I'm going to stop doing it. My personal opinion of Harvest is incredibly tainted and skewed. I should have said this at the get-go of today's discussion, but I didn't. So I guess this is the usual 30-second or whatever disclaimer, maybe it's 3-minute disclaimer, of my own take and my own opinion. I was very, very much occupied with other things during Harvest League that were not Harvest related. Namely, Mrs. Draconis and I had our fourth living child, our fifth child total. We were very, very excited to add this new little one into our family. We were counting down the days and just super duper excited, but that definitely impacted my own ability to engage with our guild, to engage with our friends on Discord, to engage with you all as a community here on YouTube, and to do any kind of streaming sort of stuff, and to keep up with the general news and the general happenings, in addition to actually playing a character and enjoying Harvest myself. The last couple of weeks prior to our newest baby's birth, we went in 5 times thinking that tonight was the night. 3 of those times were in between the hours of midnight and 4 a.m. So the rest of our kids were sleeping. We called my wife's folks-in-law, my folks-in-law, my wife's folks to come over and help watch the kids during the night. So we had a wonderful support structure, a wonderful support system, even in the midst of all of the horrendous outbreak and pandemic that has been 2020. We had a wonderful support system to make sure that this new little one would come into the world, hopefully healthy and hopefully into a happy family. But to say there were a lot of sleepless nights, and that was before we actually even had the baby. It was interesting. And then a couple of weeks later, after we brought the baby home, Mrs. Draconis sends me a message on Discord and says, hey, a piece of our ceiling just fell down. Just like a little tiny, little kernel of our ceiling fell down. I messaged her back. I said, hey, when I get done with work today, I will come into our room and clear everything out, get the baby's crib out of there for right now, and then we'll be fine. I'll deal with the rest of it after work. About 25 minutes after Mrs. Draconis got our newborn little one out of our room, the entire ceiling in our bedroom collapsed. I was literally going to be thinking about writing and working on finally some Path of Exile videos that day. I felt like our family was getting into a routine. We were trying to get back into some things, and we felt pretty good. And I remember thinking when I left the house that day, oh, today's going to be a very, very good day, and I'm going to start working on some PoE stuff. And then driving back home was, oh my gosh, what just happened to our house? Well, I guess I'm not working on any PoE stuff today. So this really skewed a lot of my opinion about Harvest. I'm going to bring the conversation back to talk about Harvest now. This really skewed a lot of what was going on because realistically, for the first month of Harvest, I really was only able to play for about 2 weeks dedicated. And even that time of dedication was really split up between a couple of different projects inside the Path of Exile experience. So it was not nearly as long a time as I would have liked to have dumped into Harvest as what could have been. And then just when we thought we were getting back into the swing of things and I could jump back into Harvest, well, then the ceiling literally fell. The sky literally fell trying to murder my child. And thankfully my child was okay. Yeah, the ceiling was really strange. It was about 3 inches thick. It was some of the heaviest stuff that I've ever lifted. It felt like solid wood, the stuff. So it was very, very dangerous. I was very, very thankful that nobody was injured. And I threw a bunch of it out. I just picked up and threw a whole bunch of stuff out of the window that's displayed there. Anyway, thankfully nobody got hurt, but it definitely skewed my approach to Harvest and my interaction with the content. So that incredibly long-winded disclaimer aside, let's now dive into what I actually thought of Harvest in terms of its actual content. A couple of things. First off, Harvest brought the most powerful item crafting into Path of Exile since Synthesis. I am a big time synthesizer fanboy. I am a bigger fanboy of the synthesizer than I am the whole rest of Synthesis. I thought Cavis was cool. I thought the voice acting was cool. I thought the story was cool. Everything about Synthesis was cool. But what was really neat about it was it essentially took rare items and it allowed you to have an item sync rather than just a currency sync by spamming currency, spamming jewelers to get a 6 socket, spamming fusings to get a 6 link, spamming chaos in order to get the right roll on something. No. Now we have a true item sync where you can combine items in order to make better rare items, in order to reduce your RNG on particular outcomes. Harvest did that. Harvest introduced a way by which we as players could make massive upgrades to our own builds through our own crafting choices by mitigating RNG and by continually improving our gear throughout the lifespan of our character. A byproduct of this was that Harvest ushered in an era where the average and casual player who had less time to play than what other players might have could genuinely start their league and go from a league start to a league finish simply working on their own stuff and improving their own stuff without having to rely on some sort of expensive style RNG simulator or using trade. The number of players who were coming to me asking for crafting advice prior to Harvest versus after and during Harvest dropped off significantly. It was massive. The amount of players interested in learning how to craft prior to Harvest versus after Harvest has shifted significantly, simply because Harvest showed players that they could actually craft their own gear, and it brought in a whole slew of players into the market of making their own stuff rather than relying on someone else to craft it for them. Okay, so I spoke pretty highly there about Harvest crafting. Let me say something that was atrocious. The Harvest garden was atrocious. It made me hate gardening. It made me hate Harvest. It made me want to quit the league, and it made me not want to pick up a new style or a new character in a new parent league like SSF or Hardcore, like not swapping over. The garden in and of itself is, I think, cool. I think in terms of its own gameplay, I've played some Factorio here this year, and so I've gotten to see a little bit of what they were aiming at or a little bit what they were inspired by. That's fine in its own game. I did not want to go into the garden and set it up again. I understand there's counter arguments to say, oh, Iron, you could just set up your garden once and then just be done with it. Yeah, make it a hideout layout, right? Make it a template. Just say, hey, I'm going to take this template from so-and-so and import it here, and boom, there's your garden. It's done. In my opinion, and you can feel free to blast me if you like, in my opinion, an action RPG is about killing monsters and upgrading your equipment. And as I was building the garden, I didn't feel like I was upgrading my equipment, and I didn't feel like I was killing any monsters. I understand that by setting up your garden in an optimal way, it would help you later on down the road, but while you're placing all that stuff, it doesn't feel like an action RPG. Okay, back on to some more good things. Harvest made rare item drops feel really good because you could have a base item drop even if it wasn't rare, even if it's just a basic normal item. You could now take a base type and then go and see that item go from a normal base type item into a magic item or into a rare item, and you had this sort of incentivized way for you to use your seeds for crafting that those seeds were going to be gone. And especially in an SSF environment, it's like, look, use it or lose it. You can either upgrade your stuff or you can let that seed rot and not use it right now and try to save it for another time. So there was a very, very neat, especially during the leveling experience, a very, very interesting curve to the player's progression. It really felt like as you were leveling your own character, it was a wise choice to interact with the harvest mechanic while you were leveling. Typically, when players are leveling in Path of Exile and there's a new league, most of the time, veterans will say, simply ignore the entire new league mechanic until you get to maps, and that's where you really want to interact with it. But when it came to Harvest, it really felt rewarding to go in and actually progress your own gear as you were leveling up, which would allow you to take on the next act or the next act boss or the next several acts with this new piece of gear that you had crafted thanks to the garden and thanks to harvest crafting. I made this argument really poorly, probably because I was sleep deprived and slightly geriatric at the time, but I think that Harvest raised the floor. It didn't necessarily raise the overall power level of what we could be inside Path of Exile, but I think what it did is it raised the floor. It raised what most players could access in terms of endgame gear. My last note and my last thought on Harvest is that I think that Grinding Gear Games gave us a small preview of what they're hoping to do with POE 2 and 4.0 in terms of making items feel good for players to craft on. I think if Harvest, which is going to be implemented in the upcoming 3.13 League, is going to stick around and is going to be a part of Path of Exile moving into the future, which at the moment it looks like it will, then I think what we're seeing here is a small window into the mind of Grinding Gear Games that is trying to make crafting more accessible for more players, so that way more players can have more stories about how they've grown their character and grown their items from a normal base item, from a normal item that drops as a white item, and simply grow it from there and take their character to new heights, to new depths, and to new challenges. Well, thanks y'all for coming by for today's discussion. I'd love to read down below in the comments what your thoughts on Harvest were. Maybe you disagreed with me. Maybe you think I'm just full of pig snout. If you think so, drop me a comment, let me know, and make sure that you call me out for using that Kermit voice, because that's just crazy. Oh, Iron, why do you always use that Kermit voice? Also, those of you who have missed Harvest while we've been waiting on it to go core, what have you missed the most? Was it the leveling experience? Was it being able to craft your own endgame items? Or was it something entirely different? Maybe you missed the encounters with Ashabi, or maybe you missed messing around in Factorio POE edition. Let me know down below in the comments, and I hope that 3.13 is the league when Americalandra drops for you.
Thanks for watching that video. If you'd like more information on any of our discussion points today, you can see them down below in the video description. If you'd also like to join our Discord or support our Patreon, you can do so with the links down below. Thanks again, and big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters.